The talk is going to be in 4 movements or 4 moments. I'm not going to spend equal time in all of them. I'm going to spend most time talking about my ongoing work in Colombia, because I'm assuming, maybe wrongly, that you're most interested in that part, but we'll make connections and we can ask questions about other things. Also, fair warning, there's also there's lots of slides, lots of pictures, because again, I know many people wanted a lot of pictures, so I'm putting those on there. But these are not National Geographic level pictures. They've also not been touched up with AI. These are photographs, most of them taken, the early ones, taken with a Minolta SLR that I had when I was a very poor student. And I gave away that camera a long time ago. So all of these pictures are mine. And so look at them sort of also with that kind of an aesthetic or maybe retro eye. They are not things that you get the fancy online Google searches. I wasn't going to say this, but I'm going to say it. The description of the talk isn't quite accurate because I didn't go back and forth between India and Latin America. I was in India, I did research in India, I ended up in Latin America. I'm back in India, so it's not a back and forth. It's actually a one-way journey, partly because I had one-way tickets, literally. Also, and we'll talk about this at the end as well, I'm not positing singular anything. There's no singular answers. I don't believe in singularity. So we'll get to that as well. So just fair warning that it's not back and forth. So I will read one line and the rest of it is going to be talk. The vast universe of non-humans that we call nature or the environment is entangled with us maliciously, deliciously, inextricably. And further ado, let's jump into the talk and I'll tell you how I came to that conclusion. I was trained as a biologist in Bombay, in St. Xavier's College, a long time ago. And I was a student in the 1980s, 1984. Many of you might remember the Bhopal disaster and the Union Carbide disaster that happened. And that was the time that in India and in the rest of the world, but I was interested in India, issues about conservation were just deeply on everybody's agenda. I was an animal crazy human being. I still am, and I wanted to study wildlife. And so I went off to study wildlife. And what you'll see is the first moment of the 1980s and 1990s where I was doing wildlife research. The first 3 photographs are not mine because I lost my luggage with all my photographs and all my negatives in it. A dear friend of mine who did this research with me will be in the audience shortly. All his photographs got eaten by ants. So these photographs, I don't have any evidence that I actually did this fieldwork. This is for a different audience. You all know the map of India. I was doing my undergraduate research on cheetal and deer. I was looking at sort of comparatively how deer behaved in the wild and in captivity. But specifically, I was studying black buck behavior in a small little, it wasn't even a sanctuary, a small forest reserve in the semi-arid region of Maharashtra. And that was my undergraduate research. I went from India to the US to study wildlife biology. I did not at that time know that the Wildlife Institute of India existed and that I could do my wildlife work here. If I had known that, I probably would not have gone, but there I was. And through a series of all kinds of coincidences, I ended up in Central America. And one central reason was 1980s, the Cold War had not ended. So you couldn't actually, it wasn't easy to do research in India. I knew that I wanted to do work in the tropics. And I was the kind of person, and I think I still am, somebody give me a ticket and I'll go if it's a place that I want to go. And so I ended up in Costa Rica, where I did my master's work on iguanas. I did do an initial project on black-bellied whistling ducks, which I found to be the stupidest birds, and I didn't want to write. If anybody likes whistling ducks, I'm sorry, but so I ended up doing research on iguanas. And this was the time when, again, I wanted to be a wildlife biologist. I was trying to be a good wildlife biologist where I was really trying to keep human beings out of the picture. And you see in these initial pictures there are no human beings. And one of my early mentors would spend a lot of time making sure that there were no human beings in the pictures, right? Because wildlife and nature is supposed to be separate from human beings. The more research I did, the more places I went. And you'll see in the next set of slides, humans are deeply, deeply, deeply entangled with, with wildlife. And maybe this is a good enough point to kind of just jump in and tell you my 2 key points that I want to make, and I'll come back to them in the end. But I want to make 2 points. One is a political point, which is that nature conservation, climate justice, environmental and development, whatever you want to call those nature terms, are deeply, 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 deeply entangled with human issues. My claim is that you want environmental conservation, you really have to work towards what I'm going to call abolition justice, epistemic justice. It has a variety of different names. You can call it the Sarvodaya movement. There's a very, very important Black geographer who works on prison abolition in the United States. She uses the term abolition justice and links ecology with the environment. There's a whole lot of folks who do that. So nature conservation requires abolition justice, social justice. Not democracy and development, not post-World War II development, not neoliberal CSRs, entrepreneurship. But my claim is that nature conservation is deeply, deeply linked to social justice. So that's the political point, if you will. The methodological point that I want to make is that the process of scientific research is also deeply, deeply, deeply embedded and influenced by politics, by history, by nationalism, by gender, race. All of these things are deeply, deeply intertwined. So I want to make these 2 points, and I'll come back to them in the end. And really what the slideshow is the journey that actually led me to make these points. And it's the first time that I'm talking about these points to a general audience. So, I tried to think really hard what general points I wanted to make. And if I want to make a general point, it is that everybody should be studying political economy or politics or nationalism or humanities, whatever it is that you want to call it. Everybody. To be a citizen, you really have to be engaged. So that would be my general point. And if you have children, you should send them to study liberal arts. So again, series of coincidences. I ended up in Brazil. And here I was in the Brazilian Amazon. There's a pointer here, which I'm incapable of using. But I lived in the Brazilian Amazon, right at the intersection of the Japura and the Solimões River. You can see, I'll try. The Japura River is here, and the Solimões River is here. And my floating house was at the intersection. It was a floating house at the intersection of the 2 rivers. At one point, it did get unmoored, and I would have floated down the river if the caboclos hadn't rescued me. So here I am with my Minolta camera taking one little photo of the tributaries. And this is actually the first tree I saw in Brazil when I went there, is this tree that was being cut down. And the next set of photographs, I'm just going to jump through. I'm very proud of these pictures because all of these spent hours and hours and hours of walking through the woods, being bitten by every bug you can imagine, lots of mosquitoes. And these were taken and put together as slides for a dear friend, Rohan D'Souza, who taught at JNU. So I went to the Amazon to do mammalian surveys, supposedly to do mammalian surveys, but my team never showed up. So I was there for 7 months, but the team who was supposed to come didn't show up. So I did other things. So these are some lovely pictures. Three-toed sloths, Victoria regia, bittern, a passiflora, I'm not sure exactly which, guanabana, I don't know what the Indian name is, Craxarubra. So here we are. Just going to go through this. I am very proud of this photograph. These are dolphins. I shot many, 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 many kilometers of water to get that little photographs. I saw them all the time, but taking pictures of river dolphins is not an easy task, especially if you're a crappy photographer like me. Most of the dolphins I saw were these. They don't actually hunt them and they don't normally eat them, but this particular one was hunted. My team didn't show up. I had to figure out what to do. I did a bunch of things, but one of the things that I ended up studying was fisheries. Part of the reason I ended up studying fisheries is I ended up fishing a lot with the caboclo communities that I was with. So I was studying fish. This is a piranha. Bottom dwellers, any of you know fisheries will probably know these. I can't remember the names of these. I was there in 1991, a long time ago. But you'll see where I'm going there. So the photographs that you saw earlier were photographs that were really inspired, or sort of, me, a biologist, trying very hard to keep people out of the picture, because that was what I was taught by my mentor. More and more time I spent in the field. And of course, I was surrounded all the time not by a large community. It was a very, very small community of caboclos, 5 houses, because it was a floating house. The closest town was 4 hours by boat. Yeah. And so I spent most of the time in the field, but here they were. Every time you thought that you were in the Amazon jungle, which I was, there were signs of people everywhere. This is the caboclos making macaxeira. Some words I don't know in English. Manioc. Bitter manioc. And it's actually a very, very, very tedious process. This takes a lot of time. You have to remove the cyanide from it. And again, it takes a long time. The cyanide is washed out. The food is dried. And then, of course, I'm sure this doesn't happen anymore. But the dried manioc lasts a really, really, really long time. And in the last set of slides, you'll see why this is important. And all of this is floating. That's my house behind. It's floating. The raft on which all of this is floating. Everything is floating. And you'll see, because the forest, that part of the forest, is the Varzea forest, it's flooded. About 4 to 5 months of the year, it's entirely underwater, or large parts of it are underwater. So everything needs to be flooded, or needs to be floating. This is my field mother, who taught me to find what kind of palms you needed to pick up to make hats. This is an important picture because here was this family, single mother with children. And I was still a biologist, but I was surrounded by people. We would talk all the time. I was a talker. I'm not so much of a talker, but I was a real talker then. So of course I was talking. And no, I didn't know Portuguese, but I learned it. And, you ask people who was fishing and they'd say, of course, we don't fish. Women would constantly say they don't fish. But you would see this all the time, that women were fishing, right? And there was a British biologist who came, who was doing research. He was a biologist, so he wasn't really talking to people, but there were all these series of assumptions that were being made about gender, about local people, about the kind of stuff that I'm studying right now. But again, both the people that you are talking to and the folks who are coming, they are telling you the same thing. Women don't fish. Folks don't have local knowledge. They don't understand how important the Amazon forest is, and so on and so forth. So here I was in the Varzea, spending 7 months, and I was leaving. This is what's happening. The water is rising and rising and rising, and it rises a lot. The macaxeira, the manioc, is something that stays for a really long time, and wintertime is very hard. There's no food, and it's usually stored on shelves. It's pure carbohydrates, but it lasts a really long time. And when the water rises so hard, it's actually hard to fish. It's hard to catch fish. It's hard to catch animals. So by the time I left the Varzea, any notion that the Amazon was not connected to human beings, to history, was all gone. Of course, I was utterly confused. I didn't know what to do with this, that, humans and nature were connected. This was also a time, I don't have photographs of this, but the initial explorations for oil were happening there. There were lots of missionaries coming in. Again, I haven't been back to this region. One of my goals is to go back. I'm sure it's utterly unrecognizable. So there I was in the Varzea forest. Now I'm going to move to moment 2. This is where I still spend most of my time. So moment 2 of my research of human nature entanglements. I leave the Varzea. I realize that humans, and especially forests, animals, which I'm deeply interested in, are deeply entangled with human beings. Again, through a series of coincidences, there is a theme here that a lot of things that happened in my life happened by coincidences, or happened where somebody would say, oh, are you interested in such and such a thing? And then you would say, oh, can you give me an airline ticket? And they say, sure. So I would get one-way airline ticket. So I was in Brazil partly for 7 months because I was literally given a one-way ticket. I did not have a ticket to come back. I did not have a visa to go back to the United States where I was supposed to go to graduate school. Of course, I had no boat to get to Tefe. So, so you can call it, you can call it resilience or foolishness. So there we go. So here we are, Colombia. I knew a lot about Colombia because a lot of the biologists I worked with are Colombians. They still are really good friends. So I actually knew a lot about Colombia, and I especially knew a lot about Colombian biodiversity. And in the 1990s, when I was starting my research, Colombia was not a country where a lot of foreigners went. And also, I'm a deep post-colonialist by birth, right? If you are Indian, and at least of my generation, our generation, you know you were a colonized country. This generation, maybe not. But you're kind of born and you know that you were colonized. You know this somehow. So I wanted to go to Colombia because it had a deep, very few foreigners went there, very few Americans went there, had a very, very, very strong national intellectual class. And as they would say in Spanish, it had mala fama, bad fame, which clearly appealed to me. But I was doing yoga, Jaya, somewhere in the audience. I know you're here. I was doing yoga that particular, every day. I used to go with my Colombian friend. We did yoga. Very good. That particular morning, we decided to play hooky. And we looked at the Colombian constitution. We never played hooky. I go to my yoga class regularly, even now. But Heidi pulled out the Colombian constitution. And what was interesting in the Colombian constitution, I'm going to jump ahead a little bit. There were three different things that were happening in the Colombian constitution. On the one hand, the Colombian constitution was giving collective property rights to indigenous communities and to Black communities that I ended up working with. At the same time, like around the world, this was 1992 that the constitution was adopted. If you all remember, 1991 is when the neoliberal reforms get really strong around the world. The Cold War has arguably ended. So at the same time, the constitution was talking about economic opening. It was also talking about biodiversity conservation, deep biodiversity conservation. So these three seemingly very, very different things were simultaneously going on in Colombia. But I was particularly interested in the issue of collective property rights at the moment when everybody else is talking about privatization. And my advisor at that time worked in Mexico. And in Mexico in the 1990s, the ejido reforms were going on, which was actually going in the opposite direction. If you all know, if any of you know, the ejidos are sort of collective property rights that the Mexican Revolution was arguing for. So even those were being privatized. So here, a very, very unusual thing is going on. So I decided, I had a ticket booked to go to Mexico, but I decided no, this was more interesting. And so I ended up going to Colombia. We'll go back a little bit. And that's where I've been working since 1992. I work on the Pacific coast of Colombia that goes from the southern part of Panama all the way to the northern part of Ecuador. All of that is the Pacific coast. Again, not the best picture in the world, but here we go. This is also crappy pictures that I took with my camera. And these pictures are important because in the latter part of the slides, you'll see what this looks like now. It actually looks like the deserts of Kutch. But this is the Rio Atrato, where there's a lot of gold mining. So I'll go through this quickly. 15 minutes, okay, good. Simultaneously, these three very odd things were going on. My initial research, what I was interested in, I'm still sort of a protobiologist, still sort of, lingering biologist. And I'm interested in understanding how Black communities use land collectively and what kind of implications that's going to have on conservation, what kind of implications that's going to have on natural resources. And those were the kind of questions I was asking. But when I went to Colombia, I again, this is early 1990s, 1992. The Cold War has just ended, lots of changes are going on. And I couldn't find real Black people, as in there was really a long discussion and lots of debates about who is really Black. So what ended up happening is that I found myself, through a series of coincidences, right in the heart of a civil rights movement. And one of the coincidences, and maybe not a coincidence, was I was Indian from India. And it was understood by the Black movement that I came from a non-aligned country. I understood, again, the younger generation may not know the notion of non-aligned movements, but it was very, very important then. I came from a non-aligned movement. I came from the land of Gandhi. In fact, 3 questions that used to be asked in Colombia when I went there all the time. Do you do yoga? Do you know Mahatma Gandhi? And do you eat meat? And I would say, Mahatma Gandhi and I don't eat meat. And every time we meet, we do yoga. It's interesting that they don't ask these questions anymore. And again, there's a slide in which I'll tell you, presence of Mahindras, it's a very, very different world. But I ended up deep in the middle of a civil rights movements and working with Black communities, and I still work with these movements. Again, looking at the intersection of environmental conservation, biodiversity conservation specifically, and again, biodiversity for a particular reason, which we can discuss later or not. Economic development, because again, large scale privatization, and strong ethnic rights. And again, the movements are arguing not just for collective property rights, they were asking for autonomy and sovereignty over the lands, over that large swath of land. 90% of the population on the Pacific coast of Colombia is Black, about 6% is indigenous, and 4% is mestizos. So the struggle then, and again, I was studying it all on all four. I was foolish and I'm continuing to be foolish in the sense that I bite off more than I can chew. So this talk is again very long. I'm focusing over a lot of different geographies. And even at that time, I was working on these 4 different states, and I was sort of looking at how the connections between ethnicity, land rights, economic development, and biodiversity is understood by the PCN, which is the Proceso de Comunidades Negras. Many of you might know. The current vice president of the country is from that movement. How the state understands it. And then I really, really was interested in how local communities understand these same things, because although it's the same issues, they are understood very, very, very differently by different people. And so I was interested in those issues, and that was what my research was in the 1990s. I spent I was there several years, but I spent a year there in 1995. This is downtown Cali, a big march against racism. And again, one of the reasons I'm showing the slides is I was in the march and people would ask me, why am I in the march, right? It's like, I look like a Colombian. I don't look Black, right? So it's like, why, as a non-Black person, are you in the march, right? And so notions of racism, who should be arguing for what, who should be struggling for what, those change as well, right? So here we are. I'm just going to go through these slides quickly. I'll get to the last part. So this is in the 1990s, movement in the 1990s. I do work on gender, but mostly I do feminist work. I do some work on women. I definitely do work on women, but that's not what my primary work is. So we will talk about issues of gender, but women and gender are not necessarily synonymous. And feminist approaches are definitely not synonymous with women and gender. I'm in a department where we often say people think we do lady studies, but we don't. This is Don Miguel making my canoe, which he didn't finish by the time I finished my fieldwork. But again, 1995, this is 2025. You do not see a single wooden canoe because now they're all made of fiberglass. So lots of changes that are going on. Okay. As a biologist, you can take pictures of yourself, but as a sort of proto-anthropologist, social scientist, you have to make sure that you have a picture that shows you were actually there. So I was there. After years of research, I finally published my book called Black and Green, Afro-Colombians' Development and Nature in the Pacific Lowlands. Took me a long time to write. And what I basically found out, what I'm arguing in the book, is that both conservation and development and movements, conservation and development, really constitute each other, that these things are deeply linked, not necessarily in a monocausal way, not in a singular kind of way, but it's all deeply complicated. It's a point I'm going to come back to because it's sort of broadly similar research that I'm trying to do in Kutch. And I continue to work with Black movements. So I'm going to take you through, so that was moment number 1, 1990s, Pacific Lowlands of Colombia. I'm going to take you through 4 decades, 1990s, 2000s, 2010 to 2020, and the current moment. This is some of the same places that I was going to. This is in 2011. And I wanted to show you logging, high-rises. So the kind of places that I showed you in the previous slides are changing very, very rapidly. And again, you'll recognize this because the same thing is happening in India, happening in Indonesia, happening in a variety of different places. So lots of high-rises. The peculiarities and particularities about Colombia is that there has been a long-range civil war that was going on. 1995, actually end of 1995, when we were doing fieldwork with Don Miguel, Doña Nati, the guerrilla came into the region. We were thrown out. We had to leave before they could find us. And then I couldn't go back actually until 1999 and then 2014. So this is long-term research, but again, I can't go back to a lot of those places because there is a civil war that the government denied from 1999 to 2010. 4 million communities, 4 million people, 4 million people were displaced from the Pacific lowlands. Most of them were Afro-Colombian and Black. Yeah. The official number, 4 million is the official numbers. The unofficial numbers is extremely high. And this is related to development, capitalism, mining, and I'll show you a series of photos that come with that. So this is 2011. This is Buenaventura. It's one of the biggest ports in the countries. These are containers, shipping goods. A lot of these containers, not so easy to see. A lot of stuff is coming from Bajaj and Mahindras. In the 1995, people were asking me about Gandhi, yoga, and meat. By the 2000s, people are still asking about yoga, but different kinds of things because people knew India more through nature cures, through Mahindras, through Bajaj, because there's lots of Bajaj scooters and auto rickshaws over there. So this is, going back one slide, the level of trade in the ports is extremely high. This is the Pacific lowlands, so it's stuff coming from China, coming from Korea, coming from India. And all of these are lands that the communities were trying to get control over. And it was in 1997 that the first collective land rights, they did not get autonomous rights, of course. They got collective land rights. So really, it's like private property, but it goes to a community. So the first collective property rights were given in 1997, and the first massacre happened in 1997, pretty much coinciding around the same time. So this is 2011. This is 2014. Important picture because 2014, there was a march led by a very, very important woman who's now the vice president of the country called Francia Marquez, who was leading her community, walking from Cauca to Bogota to fight against illegal mining. Because at this point, the level of mining is just off the charts and people are being displaced. It's legal and illegal mining. Somebody was asking me yesterday, who the armed forces are, who killed who. It's very hard to know. The violence is now deeply endemic. So guerrillas, paramilitaries, drug traffickers, police, military, it's violence, and all of these forces are in cahoots. And again, I'm sure, not the same, but similar in India, probably slightly different. In the Northeast, maybe a little bit similar. But every time there's violence, what happens is there's illegal capital and it goes into mining. Because this is gold area. And again, I'll show you a series of photos to show you. So this is in 2014 when Francia Marquez is leading a march from Cauca, from her community in Cauca, to fight against illegal mining, goes to Bogota. Years of struggle. In 2022, she becomes the first Black vice president of the country. So that's Francia Marquez. Francia and the communities, again, continue to argue for rights to their communities. A lot of them are displaced, and a lot of places are now basically mining deserts. So I'll show you what's happening right now. This is in 2019, just before the pandemic. So de facto, what's been happening is that I've been going back to the places that I've been doing research every 10 years, 20 years, 25 years. Again, I keep going back. I go back every year, but where I can go is really determined by who's still there, what armed forces are there, where you can go with whom. So in 2019, I went to a community of women that I had to work with, some women's groups that I had done a lot of grassroots work with. And in the midst of displacement, this set of women, show you the pictures, were really trying to stay in the communities. And one of the things that they were really trying to do is to make sure that their food base was secure. So by this time, I'll jump in, which I haven't said to make it explicit. My focus on biodiversity conservation has moved from wildlife conservation to really sort of, what is called cultivated biodiversity. Because biodiversity in a lot of places people have, and again, women's groups doing lots of herbs, taking care of a lot of forest plots. So I'm working much more with sort of cultivated biodiversity. And again, I'm not doing the biodiversity work. I'm working with communities to sort of think about what they're doing. So this particular set of women that my friend Mai had been organizing, had been really working hard to stay in the community. And part of the conflict and the part of the war that happened in 1999, or part of the plan, the argument against the war in 1999 was that there was a lot of drug cultivation, and what needed to happen is, it was much better when it was off. Is that they fumigate? They're trying to fumigate. They were trying to fumigate illegal cultivars, and arguably it is sort of targeted cultivation that's only going to drug crops. But that is not the case. When the helicopters go over and the chemical that's used is the same chemical that was used in Vietnam. It's a relative of Agent Orange, glycophosphates. So these women's groups sort of, they plant, they have projects to grow chickens, grow pigs. But then when the helicopters come and, there's basically, it's sort of indiscriminate fumigation. So this had been going on again and again and again. In 2019, we were there because the women's groups had again started to do this cultivation. And part of their project was to do cultivations, but they were also trying to set up ecotourism. And so we were kind of going there as researchers as well as ecotourists. And one of the other things by this time I'm working on, and again, ask me questions, please. I don't have time to talk about it, is sort of to disrupt a very romantic notion of local communities, right? That a lot of people who are talking about indigenous communities, Black communities, have a very, this notion that people are sort of have to live in very, very traditional ways. And they live in traditional ways, but again, what is tradition? And again, in the literature that many of you must be familiar with about post-development, about traditional knowledge, there is this notion that communities don't want development. That is not true, and I don't think it should be something we want to wish on. So again, part of this research was also to show kind of what communities are doing, what women's notions of development is. Okay, 29 minutes. I don't have a lot of time. This, if any of you can read Spanish, which I assume most of you can, is a poster on the wall of the church, which is basically advertising courses that people can take to be armed guards. So this is, again, one way to show how violence is deeply embedded in the community. On one side of the church is a poster like this. The groups that I work with, the Rios Unidos, United Rivers, community groups that are working for rural development. Other pillar is sort of, you can work as armed guards, because again, violence is just deeply endemic. So this is in the community in Guapi with my this photo is for you, Jaya. That's one. In 2019, this picture, of course, I had to take. Yes, there's a dog in the canoe. Of course, the dogs go in the canoe. So this is a community making, they had, bring back, the behind is a chicken coop. They had a whole lot of medicinal plants. And again, what we were doing is sort of, walking with them, sort of working on what kind of an ecotourism circuit would work. What kind of things do people want to hear? And again, I'm a researcher. I'm not, unlike my friend Taskeen, I don't do grassroots development. But this is sort of like, this is what people want, right? You're doing grassroots development. What kind of things do people want to hear? How do you talk to folks about your struggles, right? It's sort of like, it's not just traditional knowledge. Traditional knowledge, you have to tell them about fumigation. You have to tell them about when illegal groups come in, you can't go and get your chickens. And again, I'll get to that in 2025. So here we are, growing herbs. This is an azotea. Remember, even in the Pacific, like the Varzea, the waters rise a lot. So a lot of the cultivation, especially of medicinal plants, is done on floating platforms. Usually all wooden canoes are turned into azoteas. Of course, now there are no wooden canoes, so there's usually just plants. And so this is what was going on in 2019. 2019 to 2023, I cannot go back because of the pandemic. People are displaced, levels of violence rise higher and higher. 2023, I go back to Rio Atrato. This is a photograph from 1995. And the green that you see is mercury from gold mining. So if you see, there's two tributaries of the river on the right, on the tributary on the right, from mercury poisoning, from mining. Working with women's groups at that time again. And part of the reason why I ended up working with women's groups is, again, it's like people start actually also asking, a lots of questions about India and sati and foot binding, all kinds of things about India. But also women's groups at that time were struggling in the Colombian sense, lucha, struggle. The word doesn't translate. It's a good word, struggling in a good way for their rights and for their needs, and were organizing independently of the Black movements. And there were enormous tensions within the Black movements saying that if women organize for their rights or organize for their needs, it's going to dismantle or it's going to weaken the Black movement. So again, part of what I ended up studying is the tensions of gender and race, right? I'm studying a racial movement, I'm studying an ethnic movement, but then within it, there are enormous amounts of tensions. And so again, de facto, maybe coincidences, right? Research questions ask me again and again. I have research questions that I go into the field, but research questions ask me, and then I have to follow those questions. So this is in 1995. I ended up meeting these women 25 years later in 1995. And then I met them again. I didn't manage to connect with them until 2025. And again, they continue the struggles. The cooperatives still continue. What they're doing is very different. So this is 2025. This is Kibdo. And one of the reasons I have the photograph here is this Italian missionaries. I'm not going to remember exactly when, but Kibdo is an old colonial town. And that is the Church of San Francisco. And that's important because I'm going to show you pictures of Carnival. So I'm there with a wonderful young colleague of mine, Diego Mello. I'll show you his photos. And Diego has been doing research in Rio Quito. This is Rio Quito. And this picture was taken illegally. Not illegally, but you're not supposed to take pictures because those are huge mining contraptions by illegal miners. Again, it's illegal to mine them. There's armed forces everywhere. Those things are everywhere. Once you hear that the police are coming, that gets hidden. But there it is. It leaves behind these mountains of sand. And then the photograph that I showed you from air of all that deep forest, a lot of it now looks like this. So part of what, again, I'm continuing to study, I'm still studying the intersection of ecology, development, and ethnic rights. How I'm studying it is there's no linear path. This is for you, Divya Jyoti. I write proposals, but then what I do in the field, I wanted to show this picture because it juxtaposes, again, changes that are going on in a variety of different places. Wooden houses, all wooden houses, often made of really amazingly solid palm. And then most of them are now replaced by brick houses. And again, lots of contradictions here because a lot of communities work in mining even though they're against it because there really isn't any other source of income. So lots and lots and lots of contradictions. And we can talk about those as well. Okay, I have 4 minutes to wrap up. Might take a little longer. This is the community of San Isidro, where Diego has been doing work for a really long time with this wonderful set of students. But this picture I also wanted to show because this part of the project is a RED plus. Those of you that do climate change research will know. It's called Reduction in Emissions from Deforestation and something, D&D, acronym soup. And the plus, it's RED plus, and the plus is supposed to be that the benefits are supposed to go to the community. So these wonderful young kids doing research in the forest. They've started this, or they've sort of, protecting the forest. They have this amazing set of, you'll see some of them. Now I'll forget the English word. What do you call those things? Boards, right? And posters. There are little kioscos to show you the trail. And what they're doing is really interesting in the sense that they're talking to the elders in their communities. And then each little stop is where they show sort of, traditional mining, traditional hunting, traditional foods, right? Each stop has different things that they're going on. And one of the many reasons why this is amazing is all around is those mining forces that I was telling you about. And all of those mining groups also come with armed forces. So that particular day we went and we were lucky enough that we could go to the forest because if there are armed groups in the forest along the trails, you can't go. So that particular day we were, again, you go to the field, you go to the rural area, and then you just wait. Sometimes you can go, sometimes you can't. But and that's, I'm just visiting. But here are folks in the communities. There are things that you can do sometimes, things you cannot do at the time. So this is this amazing project that they are working on, these young group of very young folks. And Diego, who's in the picture up front, who does amazing work. Those of you from NCF should check out his work because he has some really interesting publications on the rights of the river. And again, those of you that are working in conservation and know Latin American literature, there are in the constitution of many Latin American countries, it is in the constitution that nature has rights. So then how does nature exercise its rights? And Diego is doing some very interesting work on the contradictions of this notion on the rights of the river. So this is what I wanted to show you. This amazing young woman who is trying to reconstruct, it's sort of fallen apart, but they are reconstructing old kitchens, traditional kitchens, the kind of things that were happening, because again, there's rapid change, as you saw in those photographs. And so these young folks are sort of trying to recuperate their own culture, but not again as either or, but sort of talking to their communities, talking to their families, learning new things, figuring out how to integrate them with jobs that they want, right? I mean, they are training as biologists, they're training as engineers. And this particular slide I really wanted to show because these are all the folks who were involved in the projects that were killed. And I think, again, I can't remember who was asking, and I can't tell you who killed them because there are so many armed forces and you can't tell who's killing you for what purpose. So, and this is common, and I don't mean to take it for granted, but it's stuff that we need to know, that these struggles are kind of happening all the time. So again, this is a project, part of the project that they put there to say, again, what does it mean to work with ethnoeducation, who were there? And it's multi-generational, which is one of the many things I love about the project, right? That the folks who are sort of keepers of the knowledge, keepers of traditional knowledge, who are trying to recuperate things are not just the old folks, are not just the young folks, that there is, talking across communities. These series of pictures, because this, I showed you the church of San Pacho, San Francisco. So the Carnaval in Quibdó, they have a huge festival every year around September, October, the Fiesta de San Pacho. And that is a homage to San Pacho. And the theme this year was biodiversity. And it's a huge five-day carnival. So each neighborhood has different costumes to represent biodiversity. But I also wanted you to see, this is from gold mining, because gold mining is what is still going on. And again, contradictions of mining that are going on in the place. And these cute little kids with birds on their hats. And this is the last picture from Colombia. This is across from the airport. This is what a lot of people want. It looks like a lot of places that you'll know. Okay. Moment 3, I won't actually talk about it. We can discuss it later if you want. So in maybe not a very linear way, you get a sense that gender, race, class, capitalism, development, ethnicity are all deeply linked together in a variety of different places. But it doesn't just happen on the ground in poor places. It happens in development institutions. And part of my idiosyncratic coincidental research is that I actually have ended up doing research, ethnographic research, in multilateral development institutions and conservation institutions. So I will just go through this very quickly. The place that I used to work with, everybody has these pictures on gender, but they don't, their focus on gender is very, very, very technical. None of the stuff that we were talking about really makes it in the research on gender. So we can come back to this later. Okay, I'm going to do this in 3 minutes because I promised myself 40 minutes, but this is 42. Movement 4, and a return home. My family is originally from Kutch. I'm a Kutchi. I speak Kutchi. I came to India in 2009 because I've been wanting to do comparative work. I returned to India in 2009 to do comparative work with Colombia and India. I wanted to see how the kind of dynamics that I'm studying in Colombia play out in India. But I really wanted to work in a language that I already knew because you lose a lot in translations. I came to Bangalore. I know lots of things are going on in the BR Hills. Lots of amazing research going on. I went to different places, but I couldn't speak the language. I speak Hindi, Marathi, Gujarati, and Kutchi. Gujarati I can. But Kutchi I can speak. So, and again, there is a way in which you want to know what, like, I'm a very traditional person. I learned a lot about tradition. So I wanted to see what was happening in my traditional homelands. So here I am in Kutch, 2019, just before the pandemic. And here's a description of Kutch. And really, if you remove Muslim Maldharis and put Afro-Colombians, this could be about the Pacific lowlands. The representations of the Pacific lowlands, biodiverse, very rainy place, and semi-arid regions is very much the same. They're considered marginal, isolated places where people are backwards, right? Very, very similar things going on. So I went actually on an A-tree project. I actually went because A-tree was there. I ended up, by now, my research is very idiosyncratic. But what I have been taught very well is to observe. Actually, that as a field biologist, right? You just observe, you take notes, you look at everything, you write about everything, and then later on you interpret. So I was there at a moment when there were a couple of economists who were working with local Maldhari communities. They had developed an app to see, and again, Dilip knows this work, I think, about prosopis. Many of you know is an introduced species, lots of trouble with prosopis. So the goal of this project was, sort of what are the pros and cons? What are the economic cost-benefit analysis of removing prosopis, which is an introduced species, but which these cattle cannot eat, but this cattle can. And in the current economy of Kutch, especially after the earthquake, and Kutch is not an isolated place, now less than ever, deeply integrated into the economy. And the milk industry is very, very, very important, and buffaloes eat prosopis. So again, there were a lot, the app and the models that the economists had produced was really interesting because they were asking the questions of, how much prosopis, and here's a very important picture. Prosopis is used to make coal, which fetches, again, it's again, Divyajyoti can tell you a lot more, right? But it's very lucrative to make coal. Should ask questions about who actually makes the coal, whether it's the Maldharis, whether it's other folks. But back to the app or the models that the economists had made. They were asking questions about ecology. They were asking questions about dairy. They were asking questions about money. They were not asking questions about labor. Because guess what? Who milks the cows? Right? So there was no space in the model of the economist to think about gendered labor, right? Because women's labor is always understood to be free. So this was, again, I'm studying not just stuff on the ground, but partly what I'm interested in is how do issues of gender, race, caste show up in conservation, right? They're there, but how do they show up? And again, there's a bunch of people in the audience who are doing amazing work, and I would love to hear or tell. So there's a few other things I can say. I'm just going to show you a few glimpses of fieldwork. Dipti was supposed to be, I don't know if she's here, so I wanted to have a picture of Dipti. And you can ask me questions about why I have these particular photographs. I'm not going to tell you. And this one is for you, Taskin. And this was in 2019. So I'll tell you right now. One of the reasons why I'm taking photographs of embroidery is because you couldn't take pictures of the women. But when we were in the field in 2022, I went back in 2022 with these young women. The women wanted to talk to us, and I do still speak Kutchi quite comfortably. I look odd in the field because I look like this, but I speak Kutchi. So, but the women in the Maldari communities that we were working with really wanted us to take photographs of their artwork. And in the previous photo, they insisted that we wear, this is somebody's trousseau, she had just gotten married. And she made us all wear these clothes and insisted that we take photographs, right? So there's a way in which, and again, this is part of feminist research that we can talk about. There's a way in which they can't be photographed, but they do want to be represented. So again, what do these photographs mean? What do these embroideries mean? What kind of narratives are going on? How do they play out in conservation and stuff that I'm trying to go through? 2019, I came back, and many of you know what's going on. I was at these protests, right? So Muslim Maldaris making claims. And again, what I didn't say is that the Maldaris are making claims on lands, and they're trying to mobilize the Forest Rights Act. They are nomadic communities. Most of them don't migrate anymore. So then again, how do notions of development, tradition, and biodiversity play out in these out-of-way places? All the stuff that I've been telling you is part of my current book project. I'll leave it there. This is part of my book project. We can talk about it or not, but I'll stop talking and let's have a conversation.
So my question was, I am actually a master's student. I'm doing my research in migration and how it affects climate and like climate-based migration and such. My question is again related to the same. You mentioned like about your movements to Brazil, Colombia, even Kutch. My question is like the indigenous and tribal communities that were living there, like, and because forest lands have a lot of those, and like because now the situation as you painted the picture here in your lecture, like when the forest land is eroding, where do these communities go? What are the migration patterns that you've observed? And also one more thing, you mentioned community land rights. What happens when the community gets dispersed because of the said erosion of land and nature?
Big question.
Thank you for a very illuminating talk. My question is, you mentioned that in Colombia, the Pacific coast has about 94% Black population. How did that come about? I would just imagine most of the, I assume most of them were brought as slaves, and they came from West Africa. And how did they end up in the Pacific coast?
Gold mining. One word, gold mining. 2 words.
Hi, I'm here.
Okay.
My name is Jay, and I work at the United Nations Environment Program. I came a bit late, so sorry for that. But so we are working on this problem of urban heat, which is increasingly it's going to affect a lot of people, especially in India. And we have our largest program in India, by the way. So I just want to understand how has cultures across the world in what way they have adapted until now, because all the modern tools of air conditioners and all, they're going to explode as uh, e- as our economy grows and the middle class expands. So, is there any, I would say, nice way to do so?
Stop using air conditioners. It won't heat
Yeah.
so much.
So, but are there any global practices that the indigenous people have adopted that we can learn from?
Sorry? Sure. These are big questions. So I don't do work in urban areas. I don't work with big organizations. And I don't believe in one size all solutions. But actually, I wasn't joking about the air conditioners. Because really, what's generating so much heat, right? Why are urban areas heating so much? Is because we're using air conditioners, which don't actually cool. But again, I'm not an engineer. So way back when I was in Delhi, there were the CUS coolers, right? And those were being replaced by air conditioners. So again, I don't mean for it to be a glib answer, but I think that these things are deeply complicated. Ask the question about why is there migration? who is using the air conditioners? Why are things heating up, right? Why are things heating up? So at some level, it'll go back to, and I'll come back. So here's sort of, you're giving me a bully pulpit. I don't have solutions, but I think techno-scientific solutions don't work, right? Saying replace it with this doesn't work. So really, as an academic, I would say is that we need the kind of training that gets people to think beyond these kind of technical solutions. Yeah. So your question of migration, again, I don't study migration. So, people go all over the place and they again go back and forth. In the community that I was working in 1995, I went back to my field site, my field mother. People were all over. They were downriver. They were in the town next door. They were in cities. They were overseas. So they migrate all over, right? The issue of land rights, the struggle continues. And part of the Afro-Colombian struggle is those are our homelands, irrespective of whether we live there or not. And in fact, they want to go live there. So the struggle is not just land rights, but what they're saying is that we want those land rights because we don't want the kind of development that's going. Now, again, struggles are struggles. They're not simple. The forces that are coming are really, really, really large. Francia Marquez is now the vice president. So she is struggling against large odds. So this is back to the very first point that I was making, is that issues of conservation, issues of rights, and again, rights is the wrong word because there's rights and there's justice. So part of the things that you're studying and confronting is the limits of the kind of approaches that folks are taking to address these large questions, right? And the answers aren't going to come in my lifetime. If we're really lucky, they might come in.
Hi, thanks so much for your talk. I'm Aparna. My question was, you said that you were trying to also draw a parallel between the movement in Kutch and the movements in Colombia. I'm just curious also to understand from your observation, are the people in power, by that I mean different kinds of stakeholders in power, both in Kutch and in specific places in Colombia, are they responding in similar manners as well?
Hi. I liked how you gave the example of how your language shaped where you chose to do your field work as well. And I just had questions of were there any other parts of like your identity or experience that influenced the questions that you asked or maybe didn't ask, or either with yourself or like grad students you've worked with or collaborators, and how you'd contrast like speaking in your native language versus working abroad where there was stuff lost in translation. Did you notice a difference in the experience or in the things that you found?
Let's stick with two, the big one. Lots of similarities. I'm trained as a Latin Americanist. I'm born and raised in India. I know a lot of things about India, but one of the first lessons that was like, it's such an obvious lesson, but I learned is that the nature of democracy and the way it works here is very different. So the state in India and the state in Colombia do similar things, but they're not the same. So there are lots of similar kinds of dynamics, right? In terms of sort of like that slide that I showed you in terms of representations of these places. And I took out because it's already a lot of pictures, but I had some slides from the Ranutsav and the way the Indian government represents Kutch, right? And then slides about the Pacific from Colombia, about how these places are represented. So on the one hand, there's this representation of these places as sort of, backwards, and these people need development. So it's a justification to bring development, but it's also sort of a lot of like, these are exotic places where you can meet traditional peoples. So there are lots of broad similarities. The specificities you really have to work through. And this is, and part of the complications of doing comparative research in a place where I worked for 40 years, 35 years, versus Kutch, where I can go only in bits and pieces. And at some level, I can go to the second questions. I can go there in bits and pieces because I'm no longer a grad student. as a professional, getting time for research is, you literally have to, as they would say in Latin America, you have to steal time. Nobody gives you time for research. So what I can do is just in little bits and pieces, access to communities, horrible word, but there you are, right? Who you can talk to. So the first couple of times I went, I was able to talk to Maldari communities because I was sort of Kutchi and woman. Now it's not so easy. And also the politics of the movements are complicated. The politics of the movements in Colombia are also supremely complicated. The politics of the movements in Kutch are also very, very complicated. And so people in power, the levels and levels of power. So how you can access communities, people you can talk to, is different. But broadly speaking, yes, very, very similar dynamics. But the specificities and the conjunctures are very different. And so it's research that's ongoing. I actually haven't written about it a whole lot because I want to be very careful because, it's like I'm no longer a political scientist, so I don't want to say this is similar, this is different. The nuances is what I'm interested in. And back to the language, at some level, I can't tell you what it's like to hear things in translation because actually I speak Spanish, and I speak it fluently. But it does determine, who you are does determine the questions that you ask again and again and again, right? It's like, so the early work that I did in Colombia had a lot to do. I ditched my recorder because I would run out of cassette tapes because the conversations were very, 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 very long. And they were sort of, again, people were curious in those days. Why are you here? So they would be like long conversations that became a field method. When I went to Kutch, not the same kind of things. There is a degree of curiosity, but there was also a degree of intimacy. Like if I say I'm Kutchi, and they ask you where your family is from, you say they're from here. There's a way in which you can have a different kind of access. But yeah, it does. And it also depends on, it's like, again, Divya Jyothi, if he goes same place, sorry, I'm pointing to you, I just know your name. So, who goes makes a big difference. Age makes a big difference. And this is also part of what I'm writing about in my current book project. It's actually called Fieldwork, about how scientific research is never neutral, right? That all of these things are deeply, deeply, deeply intertwined. And it really affects what you say. And I don't work with grad students. I do, but very informally, I actually have not trained.
Hello, hello. Yeah, thanks for the lovely presentation. I'm curious about whether there's been a qualitative change in the nature of social movements in Colombia or Latin America, because in India, the movements that occurred in the 1970s, 80s, even the 90s to some extent, are not the sort of environmental social movements that are happening right now, in that they're largely issue specific or localized, often referred to as new social movements, I think, in the literature.
Yep.
So I'm curious to hear your thoughts on what it's like in Latin America.
Hi, thank you. I really enjoyed your talk. I have 2 or 3 different things to ask. If you bear with me. One was you mentioned in the early 90s in Colombia, there was this whole um, movement for collective rights for the indigenous communities. And then later you mentioned that it wasn't autonomous rights. They basically started getting collective rights. So just wanted to understand what do you see are parallels between India and Colombia for collective rights to communities? Um, you also mentioned moving from wildlife conservation to cultivated biodiversity conservation, where the women were actually sort of looking out for their food security. So I wanted to understand what are the implications, or do they actually have food security given all the mining, the violence, also the impact of extreme weather events and the climate crisis? And thirdly, coming to Kutch, the Maldhari movement, a lot of these Maldharis actually do sell milk to cooperatives which are run or have connections to larger corporates. So, what is the kind of tension or I mean, I imagine the asymmetries that, I mean, perhaps you've observed or you probably foresee coming.
I'm not going to remember all three. The first one was about land rights, right? Can't talk about Latin America, but there's a wonderful book which is not used enough called Beyond Civil Society. It's about Latin American social movements, and it's really deep work by a number of different folks. And again, social movements, and you trained as a sociologist, so I think I'm hearing the question in a particular way too. So sociologists think of social movements in a very, very particular way. And the work that I started doing and the kind of way I'm thinking about social movements is not so much from the sociological perspective, but okay, bear with me, this is going to be slightly academic. So, early social movements were supposed to be about access to the state. And in many parts of Latin America, communities did get access to the state. In Brazil, right, Lula becomes the president. Right now, the Colombian president is a leftist, and Francia is a vice president, right? But there's access to the state, and then there are larger issues of autonomy. So the literature on new social movements in the 1990s is saying that social movements, a diversity of new social movements, are not necessarily arguing for rights or not necessarily arguing for the kind of modern democracy that again, language trips you. The way in which, let's say that those movements are not asking for democracy trademarks. So rather than talking about Latin America, let me speak specifically to the Black movements, right? So the PCN's argument was, their claim was identity, territory, autonomy. And autonomy meant that they did not want representation in the government. Or they weren't it's not that they did not want, right? They don't want inclusion in that sense. But they want a different notion of democracy, right? That's what all these movements were asking for. Except that they're not homogeneous. It's very, very, right? And indigenous and Black movements are very different. And I was studying Black movements, lots of tensions between indigenous and Black movements. And all of these turned into questions. I mean, really, one of the fundamental questions I'm asking academically, but also democratically, is what is indigeneity and how is it playing out? There's a fantastic book by Pinky Hota called The Violence of Recognition. If y'all haven't seen it, you should check it out, right? She's looking at deeply ethnographic work in Orissa, where groups, different groups are arguing for indigeneity, but the argument is deeply linked to right-wing nationalism. So across Latin America, but especially in Colombia, movements from the get-go, and this is part of what I write about in the book and sort of I'm showing, right? That communities are very, very heterogeneous. Movements are very, very heterogeneous. They are riddled with inequities, and the arriving inequities just exacerbate them. So the movements are changing. They're very, very tense. There is the state, and the state is deeply linked with capitalism. They're arguing against capitalism, but we are, there is no revolution, never was, isn't likely to be. So then how are these things playing out? So lots of changes, lots and lots and lots of tensions. And across Latin America, like across the world, most governments are actually right-wing, right? So there is, again, a huge backlash across the world against ideas of rights, forget autonomy, and they are fought with enormous amounts of violence. And again, in different places, it plays out very differently. So Bolivia had an indigenous government, no longer, right? So part of also what I'm studying with my notion of social movements is that we actually need to understand what the social is in the social movement. And if I were to go sort of really technical here, part of the argument I'm making is that both nature cultures are co-constituted. So the movements are constituted within the conjunctures of the changes that are going on. And that you see across Latin America. And specifically in Colombia, part of the reason I was showing the mining is it's deeply, deeply, deeply vexed. Arguably, people are against the mining, and they are. But there really is, your question, food sovereignty, of course there is, right? Food sovereignty is destroyed for a variety of different reasons. I can give one word, Monsanto, or other words, right? Is that capitalism is deeply embedded everywhere. So back to, this is your first question is linked to Atim's question, is that movements across Latin America and India, I was sort of studying, right? Movements are very different. I went to the Northeast. The dynamics of the Northeast are different. But again, folks are asking, now what's going on in Ladakh, people are asking for a degree of autonomy from the state, but from, and again, I'm trained as a Latin Americanist. India, I'm sort of slowly learning, but it's really slow. Here, the notion of autonomy is still linked to statehood. All right, people are asking for a separate state. Yes, deeply linked to statehood. A lot of the movements in Latin America are asking for autonomy, but not of a separate state. They're asking for different notions of sovereignty. So part of a lot of these struggles, and I think it's here too, but again, it's not, this is where, back to somebody else's questions, the notion of democracy, the history of democracy, the history of nationalism here is very, very, and so part of why I'm being very careful with this comparative work, or why it's going slow, and is that the conjunctures are very different. What I'm seeing is a lot of movements, a lot of scholars of movements are looking to Latin American literature to talk about movements, indigenous movements in India. And it only works so far. It doesn't, right? It's like, and there is this notion that land struggles or indigenous struggles have been successful in Latin America. I mean, and to some extent, yes, they have been successful to some extent, right? I mean, they call the Colombian Constitution the Constitution for angels, because if you read the Constitution, it's amazing. But of course, in reality, it's deeply, deeply, deeply ambivalent. And my writing, my deeply unpopular writing, is that I'm arguing against a very non-romantic notion of social movements. That doesn't mean that folks shouldn't be struggling, but it's like we cannot, it's like, again, folks talk about indigenous knowledge, and they talk about it a lot. In the Amazon, and I haven't been back there, but I have friends who work there, most of the people who are doing research there and the folks who live there have cancer because of all the chemicals, right? And indigenous knowledge is not going to remove that pollution. So we have to be extremely careful. And so here is really the academic point I want to make, which is actually also a general point, is that we really need to understand the history of capitalism and how it works, and the current dynamic of it, right? That there isn't a simple yes, no answer. Not arguing that folks should not be doing development, but a lot of this is just really bad. So food sovereignty, absolutely, there needs to be food movements, and they're there, but large forces are coming in. So most of the food in many of the communities, some of the slides I can't refer to now, I don't know if I put them there. But most of the places that I go back to, the food is being bought. The rivers, you can. I mean, it's full of, either the fish are gone because of all pollution, or you can't eat it because it's so filled with mercury. So the food is all coming from outside. It's, the soils are all destroyed. So I mean, it's nasty. At the same time, I mean, the movements haven't failed. Folks are struggling in really, really interesting ways. So again, one of the photographs where I showed you that it's all desert, and in one of the pictures, Diego is working with this guy. Sort of, once these things are deserts, of course, the mining folks go away. So then folks go back to try to sort of reclaim the land, but it's very, very hard. I mean, it's labor-intensive work. It's not remunerated. So again, short answer is it's complicated. Here as well as there. Yes, so they are. So one of the things, when I was there in 2019, yes, they sell it to cooperatives. And again, I'm observing, right? So I've only made 2 or 3 short field visits. So I'm seeing these things, I'm asking questions like this. There was another set of economists. Really interesting. Sorry. Oh, microphone. Oh, you have to make me, standing still is one of the toughest things. It's like I can't stand still. So, and then I lose my chain of thought. Maldaris, cooperatives, milk. Another set of economists were trying to do surveys with the Maldaris about again, what kind of milk, who was doing the milking. They couldn't get access to the communities. The communities really wouldn't let them talk to folks. So yes, there are lots of inequities. The one village where we started, first started trying to interview, they were trying to talk to a bunch of different folks, and there were, like all communities are internally heterogeneous. And one of the questions that the economists were asking was like, who has how many cattle? But and there was one sort of, Dalit guy. They wouldn't let him talk. So part of what I'm interested in, and this is research that I would like to do after the book is done. Maybe it will get done. The book will get done. Don't know about the research. I'm interested in what kind of inequities get exacerbated in social movements with the dynamics that come, or what kind of new inequities are produced, right? And it doesn't necessarily have to be inequities, but changes in dynamics. And again, I'm pointing to Divyajyoti because his work is amazing and I want him to publish it because he's working with Vadagodi communities in Kutch. And you kind of see how, I'm going to use the word caste in quotes, right? That how do these heterogeneities work out? So these are questions I have. I would like to go back and find out. I have not been able to. And I'm assuming it's there, not assuming. Every community has these internal things that go on. And it requires really slow, careful asking of questions or doing field work of just hanging out and talking. And for the most part, people will hang out and talk to you. For the most part. What they'll talk about, the conversation can't go in a straight line and meanders all over the place. But that's okay.
So you
Hey,
started.
Samir.
You started when you started. You were interested in biodiversity conservation.
I still am.
Okay, that's even better. Can you give us a few examples of successful conservation projects? Not projects, but something that has really grown and scaled. Something that you would like to see in India
Oh my God.
across these geographies, across like 4 decades. Nothing.
Wrong question for me. Sorry? No, it's right on topic. I don't know. I guess we can say tiger conservation is super successful. So, I mean, again, I said, I don't know, right? Exactly. What would I like to see in India? I mean, okay, back to you. So I'll go back to the first point. What would I like to see in India? Please, it's a very quixotic notion, I'm told. I mean, successful conservation will work if there's successful revolutions and justice, right? It's like, we are not a post-colonial nation. So what would successful conservation look like in India? What would I like to see? Nobody going hungry, nobody being abused, everybody living a dignified life. I mean, sorry, Samir, I don't have a good answer for you. That is what biodiversity conservation is, right? It's like it's like humans connected to nature, but again, maliciously, deliciously, inextricably. But one of the things I wrote down, which I didn't read, there are no innocent connections. There are no non-political connections, right? So it's a struggle. Biodiversity conservation, arguments against fortress conservation, right? One of the chapters in the book, one of the things that was in there is like Bombay Natural History Society, Ullas Karant, people talking about wildlife reserves, big notion of we really need to take people into consideration. But then people come in, and people need to eat, people are not romantic, people are not singular. And the forces that come into a lot of places in conservation, and again, I actually can't speak for India because I left in 1987. And I don't do very active research here. You should ask Dilip. I have a project with him about Ladakh. I haven't been to Ladakh. But not increasingly, all over, right? The problems of conservation really are problems of capitalist development. That's really what it is. The incursion is extractive mining everywhere. That's what's there really everywhere. So what would I like to see in India? An end to capitalism. And this talk will go online, and I'm trying to go back to the United States. If I don't get back, Samir, I'm coming to your house.
Hello. Thank you for the presentation. It was really nice. My question is slightly off topic. It's about food. In general, in Latin America, what kind of changes did you see food in 1970s or 80s? You were there, and
I
when you
wasn't
went-
there in the 1970s and 80s. I was right here, but no more.
Okay. Yeah. So, did you see any drastic changes in food? And also, in these forest areas, did you see any specific like mushrooms used in their
Oh my
food?
God, you're not going to go to ayahuasca, are you?
No, no, no.
Okay.
I work with wild mushrooms as food sources, so I'm interested in because I see that mining. There's a lot of mining that would have surely affected. So I would like to observation.
Thanks. Mushrooms, no, actually, it's a good question, but I don't know. I hope you know Anna Singh's work, Mushroom at the End of the World. If you don't, it's an amazing book. So, no, actually, I don't know about mushrooms or whether they were eating. Can't talk about Latin America, too large a continent. Can't talk about Colombia because that's sort of the world I know. And I'll give you two examples. Broad question about food. Bogota, big capital city. My best friend there is a big fan of the local market, so we go to the local market a lot. Food questions you should ask the scheme. And the market is really, it's amazing. It's huge, full of produce. And in the last few years, there's a lot of Asian produce. I didn't have these photographs here, but I took photos the last time I was there in September. You can get chai, and you can get instant chai in Bogota. So lots and lots of changes. You can get kimchi. You can get a lot of Chinese foods and spices, which you didn't, 10 years ago, even 5 years ago, I don't remember seeing it. But now there is a lot of, right? It's like food is globalizing, people are eating, all those kinds of things. In the Pacific lowlands, which is again what I know, massive changes in food of two kinds that I was telling you about. The food is coming from elsewhere because of the mining. There's just a lot of stuff is not grown there because the soils are contaminated, the water sources are contaminated, but also again global aspiration. So Quibdó, which is a very, very tropical city, I really struggle with food more than ever this time because once upon a time you could actually get plantains and fish. Now there is a lot of meat, which I don't eat. Fish I do, and a lot of carbohydrates because everybody sort of, everybody's trying to emulate like the West, right? So you get crappy cakes like you get here. So I'm seeing changes in terms of that, right? It's like, there are coffee shops like the coffee shops that you see over here. So there's a lot of erosion of local food biodiversity for a variety of different reasons, including kind of middle class aspirations, right? People want to appear cosmopolitan, and why should they not? So in seemingly very, Quibdó wasn't remote, but it was fairly isolated from these kind of currents. Now those foods have changed massively. So you see that on the streets, you see that in what you can get in restaurants. Yeah. Last question.
Hi, I'm Nayantara. It was lovely to hear your stories and perspectives. And because we went through movement 3 quite quickly,
We did.
I would just request you to sort of go back to that and talk about, your examination of institutions doing researching conservation and how you also relate that to what you brought up later, fieldwork. So what's that been like? What have you found? There were a few organizations that were listed also. I was curious to know why. And yeah.
Why? Because these are the organizations I've worked with or worked in. So when I found out that, or when I sort of realized that human beings were deeply implicated in biodiversity and deeply implicated in development issues, or that if I wanted to do biodiversity conservation, I really needed to understand development. So my first stint was at the World Bank, because we all love to hate the World Bank, and I was an intern at the World Bank in 1992 when the Rio conference was going on. And so what I see at the World Bank, and remember that the global, you don't know, the Global Environmental Facility is located at the World Bank. And if you don't know, the Global Environmental Facility is this world fund that's supposed, right? So part of what I was interested in is how are these connections between nature, culture, environment development happening in these different organizations? And so that was that's part of the research. How is it happening? And again, this is sort of a technical argument, but not so much, right? Nothing in the world is static. All of these things are being created in a particular way. So if movements for sovereignty, movements for land rights are arguing for a particular notion of biodiversity and rights, these organizations are very actively pushing particular notions of nature cultures, right? So these happen to be the organizations I was working with. CIFOR, the Center for International Forestry Research, is one of the CGIAR institutions. It's no longer there. It's now consolidated with ICRAF. And again, I haven't spoken so much about colonialism yet because, of course, I do everything but the kitchen sink and add in the kitchen sink as well. So part of this is also to see. I went to CIFOR because I got a job there. I don't know how I got a job there, but I got a job there. I needed to leave the US. I wanted to learn another language before I was 50, so Indonesia provided a great excuse. But what was interesting about CIFOR, where I bumped into coincidental global middle class, a lot of the people I went to graduate school with, the folks that I had done my biology work, they were all there. But C4's notion of conservation is very, 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 very colonial. And notions of development is very, very colonial. And the entire, as an organization, it was unapologetically white. Most people who work there were white. Most of the folks in the senior positions were white. Unapologetically so. Social movements, gender, feminism is ideology. It's not real science. They believe in evidence-based science. So part of the third movement, it's chapters, one of the chapters in the book. And it's looking at how there's a very actively, some folks are resisting, a whole bunch of folks are resisting a certain notion, but it's very, very actively being produced in these places. So movement 3, not done yet, but there it is. And institutions, our institutions, I don't know where you are, but my institution is written there, Sustainability Initiatives at UMass. They had a survey that they did a few years ago, a terrible survey, the kind of surveys where it's like the answer is in the survey. How many of you believe that overpopulation causes climate change? Or do you believe that overpopulation, bad survey design, right? But those notions keep continuing. So our institutions are also pushing certain kinds of notions. If you look at the UMass sustainability site, it's all technocratic. It's entirely technocratic. I teach climate change. I teach sustainability. My classes are not listed in the sustainability initiatives, right? It's like, heaven forbid, I might indoctrinate the students. I mean, they're right, I would. So, all right, we're done.